Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine begun with massive missile and artillery strikes. In the first hours, many objects, military and civilian, including ordinary residential buildings, were hit. Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border and began a rapid advance deep into its territory. The armed forces of Ukraine began to fight back. But what do you know about Ukraine besides the war? The history of Ukraine and its economy has never been easy. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union. Now the country has begun the transition from a state-planned economy to a market economy. Now, when planning the production of goods, enterprises had to be guided by customer demand rather than by the state plan, as was usual in the communist system. The Soviet ruble was replaced by a temporary currency, the karbovanets, also known as coupon. During the presidency of Leonid Kravchuk, the first president of Ukraine, as well as in other post-Soviet and socialist camp countries, the privatization process was initiated, but it was not conducted transparently and without the participation of foreign investors, among other reasons due to lobbying by directors of Soviet enterprises. This enabled the so-called Red Directors to continue receiving subsidies from the state without the need to develop the enterprise and compete with other companies. During the rule of Leonid Kuchma, the privatization process continued, and a rather limited circle of people, who would later be called oligarchs, were given the opportunity to take possession of various plants and industries. Ukrainian Oligarch Starter Pack. A set of large factories that have been at his disposal since the 90s, for example in the metallurgical sector. Family ties to the current government, suspected links to criminals, frequent trials on charges of money laundering, a media empire, real estate in London, and a huge yacht. If you look at GDP, you can see that it has only been falling since declaration of independence. In 1993, Ukraine plunged into a massive crisis. Unemployment was rising, wages were not paid, minor strikes were taking place. Large sums of money were allocated from the state budget to maintain low tariffs for housing and utilities and to subsidize inefficient loss-making enterprises. Taxpayers' money is not enough to provide the basic needs of the state, so the printing press was turned on. In 1993 alone, inflation reached a record 10,000%. A good illustration of the crisis of that time is the 1 million karbovanets banknote. In 1996, after inflation was slowed down, the hryvnia was introduced, a currency that is still used in Ukraine today. In 1997, the Ukrainian economy was hit again, now because of the Asian crisis. And in 1998, the Asian crisis was one of the reasons for Russia's default, which also had a bad effect on Ukraine because Russia was a major trading partner. After some growth in 1997, Ukraine's GDP hit the bottom in 1999. For comparison, at the same time in Poland, with a population of 38.6 million people in 1999, which means about 10 million people less than in Ukraine, almost 2 times smaller area. GDP since 1990 has been constantly growing with very small drops and was more than 5 times higher than in Ukraine that year. One of the main reasons for this difference is the fact that Poland was not a formal member of the USSR. Therefore, Polish society did not suffer so much during the adaptation to the market economy, and all the processes that took place in Ukraine, including privatization, were faster and less painful. In the last year of the 20th century, 2000, we can see positive changes. In the 2000s, foreign companies and banks began to enter the Ukrainian market, and with them came investments. At the end of 2004, the Orange Revolution took place. As a result of repeated presidential elections, Viktor Yushchenko became president. The previous election results were invalidated due to massive violations and falsifications. And here is an example of how corruption in the process of privatization hurts the state. In 2004, a large metallurgical plant located in Kryvyi Rih was privatized. The terms of the tender were drawn up in such a way that all foreign participants were excluded, and the plant was purchased by a consortium of 2 Ukrainian magnates, Reinat Akhmetov and Viktor Pinchuk. They paid just over $800 million. It looks like it's a lot of money. But after that, the previous auction was annulled and the plant was reprivatized at the second auction, which was broadcast live. This time foreign companies were admitted. Plant was sold for almost $5 billion to the foreign company Arcelor. Between 2001 and 2008, metals and chemicals prices boomed because of international economic growth, while the price of natural gas imported from Russia remained low. In general, in the 2000s there was quite rapid economic growth in Ukraine, but you probably know what happened next. The crisis of 2008 severely hit Ukraine's economy. The hryvnia was devalued from rate of 5-1 to 8-1 to the US dollar. Average wages fell by more than 28%. Unemployment rose moderately. For example, demand for metals fell and so did prices. Ukraine's GDP fell by 35% in 2009. Sharp drops after quite strong growth have become some kind of tradition for the Ukrainian economy. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych became president. The hallmarks of the policy of that time were low tariffs for housing and utilities due to subsidies and maintaining an artificial hryvnia-dollar exchange rate of 8-1 at the expense of state money. But this did not help when the government rejected Ukraine's pro-European course in 2013, so massive protests began. In February 2014, Yanukovych left the country. Almost simultaneously, Russia annexed Crimea and pro-Russian forces began to seize power in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Political instability, of course, affects the growth of inflation and devaluation of the national currency. Of course, inflation in 2014 is incomparable to what it was in the 90s. Nevertheless, it is a very significant increase. The situation is worsened by the fall in average wages. At the same time, the fixed exchange rate of the hryvnia to the dollar was impossible to maintain and it gradually went up. The low dollar exchange rate was maintained at the expense of international reserves, which in 2014 were at the bottom. But to the troubles related to the revolution itself, problems have been added due to the loss of territories and the beginning of Russia's hybrid aggression in the eastern regions. For example, the Crimean Peninsula. This can be considered the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian War, and thanks to this event, the Russian narrative of brotherly nations of Russia and Ukraine collapsed for many people. Among the losses for the state are minerals that were extracted on the peninsula, energy facilities, and so on. But also the production processes of some companies on the mainland of Ukraine were significantly disrupted. For example, fluxing limestone, which was mined in Crimea, was very important for metallurgy, so producers had to look for alternatives. Ukraine lost most of its navy. As for Donetsk and Luhansk regions, they were the industrial centers of Ukraine and also where most of the coal needed for heating and power plants was extracted. Both of these regions were far from fully occupied from 2014 until the start of a full-scale invasion in 2022. But the losses are very significant because many mines and enterprises have been taken over by separatists and de facto Russia and destroyed as a result of military operations. If in 2013 Ukraine produced 83.7 million tons of coal, the following year it was 64.9, and in 2015 even less, 39.7 million tons. Also, shortly before the events described above, shale gas production was about to start here, which would make Ukraine more energy independent. Deposits of this gas are located in the west and east of the country in the Kharkiv and Donetsk regions. Ukraine is estimated to have at least 2 trillion cubic meters of shale gas in the east of Ukraine, which is technically possible to extract. In general, Ukraine is estimated to have third largest explored reserves of this gas after Poland and France. The production was supposed to take place jointly with Shell and Chevron, but with the beginning of the confrontation in the eastern regions, this idea was rejected. Going back to the problem of the loss of coal mines. Obviously, there was a problem for the energy sector because fuel for thermal power plants had to be obtained somewhere. Therefore, the resource was imported from the occupied parts of the eastern regions, South Africa, and even Russia. In the following years, the import of coal directly from Russia continued with pauses. Petro Poroshenko won the presidential election in 2014. Ukraine continued to move closer to the European Union politically and economically. The government was forced to introduce gradual reforms in order to receive loans from the International Monetary Fund and to meet the criteria for membership in the European Union. The Ukrainian economy has begun to recover from the shock of the hybrid conflict with Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky became president in 2019. 2021 was the last year before a full-scale Russian invasion. The population was about 41 million people. GDP reached an all-time high of almost $200 billion in 2021. The average salary reached the value of $525. Despite gradual development, Ukraine remained one of the poorest countries in Europe if we look at GDP per capita. It is also worth mentioning the problem of corruption at different levels, from household to high levels of government. Of course, it was partially possible to complicate corruption by introducing a transparent system of government procurement, for example. And as for the condition of the Ukrainian army, when Ukraine got independence in 1991, 2021, after the USSR had had an army of about 800,000 people, more than 9,000 tanks, 11,000 armored infantry vehicles, more than 1,000 combat aircraft, and 900 helicopters. Ukraine also had one of the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world in 1991. In 2021, the number of armed forces was about 250,000 people, about 1,000 tanks, nearly 3,000 armored combat vehicles, 120 aircraft, and about 80 helicopters. And of course, back in the 90s, Ukraine gave up the status of a nuclear state. The reasons and the process of reducing the quantitative indicators of the Ukrainian army is a topic for another video. It is also worth noting the explosions at ammunition depots in different parts of Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea and separatist movements in the east of the country. Hundreds of thousands of shells were destroyed at the time. There were theories that these were attempts to cover up the plundering and selling of ammunition by the people responsible for storing it, but after the invasion in 2022, there are still suspicions that these were Russian sabotage. This video was made in July 2024. The war is still in full swing, and it's possible and looks further away than it seemed at the beginning of the invasion. But let's go over everything in order. With the start of a full-scale Russian invasion in 2022, the problems caused by previous territorial losses since 2014 have been a minor warm-up. An obvious thing that happens during any war is a large number of refugees. According to statistics, there are more than 700,000 internally displaced persons in Ukraine, and more than 6 million have gone abroad. With the beginning of the invasion, the entire militarily liable population was forbidden to cross the border, which means that men between the ages of 18 and 60 who are fit for military service mostly stayed in Ukraine. The majority of refugees abroad are women and children. Initially, the Russian government stated that the purpose of their special military operation was to protect the people of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, as they called the occupied parts of the respective regions. But the invasion came from all possible directions, including from the territory of Belarus by the forces of the Russian army that had previously accumulated there, and the fighting began in 9 regions. There was an attempt to land paratroopers near Kiev at Gostomel Airport, but it was foiled by the defenders of Kiev. The failure of this plan can be considered one of Ukraine's strategic victories at the beginning of the war, because if Russia had been able to land a large number of paratroopers, intense fighting could have begun in the city itself, with possibly disastrous results for Ukraine. In the south, on the contrary, the Russian army had a rapid advance in the Kherson region. In the Donetsk region, the city of Mariupol was completely surrounded. At the Azovstal plant, the Azov battalion held the defense for 82 days, until it was decided to surrender to save the lives of soldiers, as well as civilians of the city who were hiding at the plant in bomb shelters. Already in early April, the Kiev region was completely liberated and the immediate threat to the capital disappeared. On April 13th, the flagship of the Russian Navy cruiser Moskva was hit by a Ukrainian Neptune coastal missile system. This is Ukraine's first success at sea, especially since Ukraine lost its navy with the loss of Crimea. Just before the invasion and beyond, Western partners transferred small quantities of weapons, but they allowed the Ukrainian army to somehow repel the aggression. On May 23rd, the first HIMARS arrived in Ukraine, which allowed to strike objects at a relatively long range and with high accuracy. Nevertheless, the arms deliveries are increasing rather slowly, not to mention the long discussions on the transfer of new, more powerful weapons. The defense of Ukraine is given very difficult because it is obvious that Russia has a larger number of soldiers and equipment. In early July, almost the entire territory of the Luhansk region was lost for Ukraine. As for Ukraine's place in the global economy, Ukraine is an important supplier of agri-products. Ukraine ranks high in various lists of leading exports of cereals, honey, etc. With the beginning of the invasion, all seaports of Ukraine stopped working. Bypass routes of food supplies from Ukraine to Europe and from there further by rail could not compensate for the shutdown of ship traffic in the Black Sea. This, in turn, caused a rise in food prices all over the world, and also worsened the problems of hunger in different regions of the earth. On June 22nd, the so-called grain deal was signed with the participation of Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and the UN. The agreement allowed cargoes to be delivered from some Ukrainian ports via a safe route to Turkey, where they will be checked for compliance with the terms of the agreement. Thus, hundreds of ships have transported millions of tons of foodstuffs from Ukrainian ports. After Ukraine attacked the Crimean Bridge, which was built by Russia after the annexation of Crimea and was used among other things to supply the army group, Russia withdrew from the deal and began systematic shelling of Ukrainian port infrastructure and grain storage facilities. After Russia's withdrawal from the deal, Ukraine had to secure a maritime corridor in the Black Sea on its own. Security in the Black Sea increased with each new success of Ukraine at sea, the liberation of the Snake Island, regaining control of oil rigs in Black Sea, and many missile and drone attacks on different Russian warships. On September 6th, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv region began. As a result, almost the entire occupied part of Kharkiv region was liberated very quickly. After the occupation troops were driven away from the regional center of Kharkiv, artillery shelling of the city stopped. But constant strikes with ballistic and cruise missiles and then planning bombs continue to this day because of the proximity to the border with Russia, which complicates the work of the air defense forces. On September 21st, partial mobilization was announced in Russia. Late September, early October, Russia in its constitution stated Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions as regions of Russia, despite the fact that Russia did not even fully control the territory of these regions. Referendums on accession were quickly held with predictable results. In early October, the Ukrainian offensive in the Kherson region gained momentum. The Russian army was pushed back to the left bank of the Dnipro River. In October, large-scale attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure began. Obviously, power shutdowns have a negative impact on any business or enterprise, including large factories, small cafes or stores. Most of them have acquired generators. Water supply and heating in winter also depend on electricity. It is also worth mentioning that in the new high-rise buildings, the stoves are electric, not gas, as in the older houses built during the Soviet Union. Therefore, people had many problems in the winter of 2022. The World Bank predicted a contraction of the economy of up to 45%, yet GDP fell by only a third. The first year of the full-scale invasion was marked by rapid inflation. By the end of the year, it rose by 26.6%. This situation was caused by a number of factors: complicated logistics within the country and difficulties in importing imports, the shutdown of a significant part of production, the fall of the hryvnia, and the rise in energy and food prices on global markets. The hryvnia emission was also an important factor in the price increase. In the first half of 2022, the MBU financed the state budget by purchasing military bonds worth 125 billion Ukrainian hryvnias. In the second half of the year, the MBU decided to print an additional 30 billion Ukrainian hryvnias per month. According to the MBU and IMF forecasts, inflation was expected to be slightly lower in 2023, at 21 to 22%. However, the reality turned out to be better, and prices rose by only 5.1%. The year 2023 was characterized by Russian attempts to advance in different directions and gradual progress. Especially noticeable were the efforts of the Russian army to capture Donetsk region. The main driver of economic growth in 2023 was the adaptation of businesses and households to the war conditions. In the first half of the year, private consumption recovered rapidly amid stabilization in the foreign exchange market and expectations of a successful counteroffensive. In the second half of the year, the economy was supported by a good harvest, no electricity shortages, and a resumption of exports by seaports. During the war, the structure of the economy changed. Public spending is taking an increasingly large share in the overall picture. In 2023, Ukraine's GDP grew by more than 10% compared to 2022. This growth can be interpreted as a result of the low base effect. I want to be frank, the Ukrainian economy and state would not have been able to survive for so long without outside help. I mean not only assistance in the form of equipment and weapons, but also finance. In 2022, Ukraine received $32.2 billion in loans, guarantees, and grants. In 2023, this aid increased to a record $42.9 billion. In 2024, it is expected to drop to $37.4 billion, even if the EU and the US deliver all the promised funds. In 2025, the National Bank of Ukraine expects to receive $25.1 billion, and in 2026, $12.6 billion. Defense spending is a priority, so most of what Ukraine earns on its own is spent on the army, and financial aid is used to finance its other needs. For example, according to Ukraine's state budget for 2024, revenues will amount to 1.8 trillion hryvnias and defense spending to 1.7 trillion hryvnias this year, which equals about $41 billion. Public debt already stands at 85% of GDP, although in 2021 it was quite modest at less than 49%. This rapid change was caused by a simultaneous economic downturn and increased borrowing. The total amount of public debt at the beginning of 2024 reached $145.3 billion. According to the IMF, Ukraine's public debt will continue to grow, reaching 100% of GDP in 2025. At the same time, the situation does not look catastrophic, as debt repayment is spread over a long period. Also, Ukraine's current public debt does not look extraordinary compared to a number of developed countries. In particular, in France it reaches 110% of GDP, in the United States 120%, in Italy 137%, and in Japan an extraordinary 263%. Of course, it is easier for these countries to borrow for a long time and at low rates, but their experience shows that the increase in liabilities is not a sentence in itself. The media's focus on foreign aid to Ukraine may give the impression that Ukraine's own budget revenues have collapsed. However, this is not the case. While the budget for 2022, approved before the full-scale invasion, included revenues of 1.3 trillion hryvnias, in 2024 this figure increased to 1.8 trillion. On June 6th, Russia blew up the Kharkov hydroelectric power plant. At night after 2 a.m. local time, seismic sensors in Ukraine and Romania detected powerful explosions. Dozens of settlements on both banks of the Dnipro River downstream were flooded. At least several dozen people were killed, including in the occupied territory. Obviously, many people lost their homes, triggering a new wave of internal displacement. The Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south that began in early June has not been as successful in terms of territorial gains as Ukraine's previous operations in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions. There are many reasons for this, among them Russian dominance in the skies, as well as the Russian army has learned lessons from previous attacks and therefore built strong fortification systems and created large and very dense minefields in the occupied territories. The year 2024 began with the Russian army's continued offensive on various fronts and fairly significant advances in the Donetsk region, although Ukraine also had some military successes, such as the shooting down of an airborne radar plane and an ongoing campaign at sea to reduce the Russian Navy's capabilities through missile attacks and drones. In 2024, Ukraine's military budget will amount to 21.6% of GDP. By comparison, in 2021, Ukraine spent the equivalent of 3.2% of GDP. In fact, Ukraine had to revitalize its military-industrial complex, which had only degraded since independence and until recently. It had to scale up not only existing industries such as the production of mortar and shells for them, but also to stimulate the development of new industries such as unmanned aerial vehicles, land drones, water drones, and so on. The government stated that the production of Ukrainian artillery shells increased by 2.5 times over the year and mortar shells by 42 times. Ukraine made an even more significant leap in drone production. In 2021, only 7 companies were producing drones, and now there are about 100 to 150. In order to stimulate the development of manufacturers and help them in various aspects, a government project Brave One was created, which also allows small manufacturers to receive grants. For example, Ukraine's development of its own long-range drones allowed it to strike deep into Russian territory, thus hitting many oil depots, refineries, and other objects. The frequency of strikes increased significantly in 2024. In the spring of 2024, Russia started a second campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. The civilian population was put to a new test because the attacks on Ukraine's generating capacity were even more effective than in the fall of 2022, and also because the summer is very hot and prolonged power outages not only cause inconvenience but also negatively affect people's health due to the inability of air conditioners, fans, etc. to work. The future is not clear, but now the situation looks like Russia is still able to maintain the current pace of fighting as it has for years, despite the rather large losses in manpower and equipment and several times higher than Ukraine's according to Olescent researchers, although very rapid breakthroughs should probably not be expected. On the other other hand, Ukraine is very dependent on arms supplies and financial aid from the USA and Europe, although the situation with its own weapons is getting better by the third year of the war. There is also a trend towards cooperation between Western and Ukrainian arms companies with prospects of opening enterprises in Ukraine. It is not easy for citizens, especially in frontline and occupied towns and villages, but in regions where there is relative stability, people are adapting to the conditions of life during the war. The fight goes on.